Okay, good evening everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this event and thank you very, very much to each and every single one of you for that little cold walk, down from Blythwood Square, and for turning up in such good numbers. The demonstration and this event have been organised by what we called ourselves the Alliance of Concern, which is made up of Care Not Killing, Our Duty of Care, the Glasgow Disability Alliance, the Catholic Parliamentary Office, and the Campaign Against Assisted Dying. The Campaign of Assisted Dying is a group of concerned citizens which started in Clydebank but has grown across the country. And a special thank you this evening to our speakers who have given up valuable time here to address us. They all come with a lot of experience in campaigning against state-assisted suicide, because that's what we're talking about, not assisted dying, but state-assisted suicide. I'm sure that you will leave this evening with lots of thoughts about the introduction of a law which will apply only to some people but affects us all in some way or another. And so to start the evening, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, is Dr. Gillian Wright from an organisation called Our Duty of Care, which is a group of healthcare professionals opposing the intentional killing of patients by assisted suicide or euthanasia. Dr. Gillian is a medical ethicist and a former palliative care doctor. She is a medical doctor who trained in general hospital medicine and palliative care. She changed to work in the sphere of medical ethics in 2018 and worked for the Scottish Council on Human Bioethics in Edinburgh until 2020. And she's going to speak to us about palliative care and the medical problems. So please welcome Dr. Gillian Wright.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be with you on such a cold night. It's a very impressive turnout, and it's lovely to see a number of well-kempt faces from different places, from different meetings and different occasions. Thank you so much for your kind introduction, and it's absolutely right. I think I'm a little bit smaller than everyone else. Absolutely. My background was in palliative care. I worked in hospitals and in hospices until 2015, and then I changed to work in medical ethics. And it was then that I realised that assisted suicide was the issue of our generation. And I changed to work for Care Not Killing, and we have started to build a campaign group of healthcare professionals who are concerned about assisted suicide and euthanasia. So some doctors are in favour of assisted suicide and many are not. And I don't represent all doctors, but I do represent a significant number who have huge concerns about the proposed law. For example, nearly 95% of palliative care doctors in Scotland are opposed to assisted suicide and would refuse to prescribe lethal medication. And I wanted just to tell you a little bit about my first experience of working as an on-call surgical house officer in a big hospital in England. And I remember the first time that I got what was called a fast bleep, and I had that heart sink feeling and started to run up the stairs. And I remember thinking, what might it be? Would it be a torrential bleed or someone with a ruptured appendix? And all the the potential emergencies went through my head. And I got to the top of the stairs, and a really kind nurse took me to one side and said, "I'm really sorry, doctor, but there's a young man who's about to jump out the window." And I just remember feeling sick and feeling very ill-equipped for that. I remember thinking, why have they called me? Why had they not called a consultant psychiatrist or any consultant, or at least somebody senior? And then I remembered, because I was the doctor and because I had a duty of care and he was my patient. And so between us, and it was mostly the nurses and his family actually, they managed to talk him down and persuade him to come back onto the ward and to talk about whatever it was that had made him feel that life was not worth living and he could not go on. And I just want to tell you that, not to distress you, because I know it is a distressing topic, but just to remind all of us that this is what we are talking about. We are talking about assisted suicide in the context of a terminal illness. And even though it is termed assisted dying or the assisted dying bill, we have to go back to the original term, which is assisted suicide. And the minute that doctors begin to concede that some lives are not worth living, that some suicide is not tragic, but rather a reasonable response to challenging circumstances, we lose not simply who they are, but actually who we are as well. And we lose the essence of who we are as a society. Because the prohibition of killing, the prohibition of the intentional taking of life, is the cornerstone of civilized society. Assisted suicide is assisted dying is assisted suicide in the context of a terminal illness. And the Royal College of Psychiatrists, in their evidence to the Scottish Parliament on this bill, have said such a title is misleading. It says it represents one set of views on assisted suicide. It could appear to include all palliative care, and it is too broad. So what is terminal illness? Well, the MacArthur Bill, so before the Scottish Parliament, describes it as an advanced and progressive disease, illness or condition from which someone is unable to recover and can be reasonably expected to cause their premature death. And that is just so broad. That could be advanced heart failure or advanced respiratory disease. It could be MS, advanced liver failure, as well as those with difficult pneumonia or difficult cancer. It could include some of those with early dementia. Indeed, 1 in 4 of all of those in hospital admissions are those in the last year of their lives. So I guess what I'm trying to say this evening is that this is the wrong solution to the problem of distress at the end of life. There must be a better way, and that must be better palliative care. And that assisted suicide is not safe, but it's also not right. Absolutely, there are families and patients who are distressed at the end of life. And if we take anything from this debate, from all the coverage that is in the media, then we must listen to those who have had difficult experiences of loved ones dying. But I just would put it to you that I just remember those who might be admitted to a hospice and say, "I just can't go on, doctor. I just can't do this anymore." And we did relatively simple things for them. You know, we treated an infection, we gave their family a rest, we helped maybe with their mobility and their toileting, and we gave them a chance to think about the things that mattered to them. And then often at the end of, it could just have been 2 or 3 weeks, they would have changed their mind. And I guess I'll just put it to you that palliative care can involve so much of that is good in our society. getting alongside people when they are finding things difficult and distressing, and providing them with the care that they need. And at the moment, people simply don't get enough care at the right time. 1 in 4 people don't get the palliative care that they need. And it's particularly those who are elderly, for those who don't have a cancer diagnosis, and for those who are from ethnic minorities. And also, it's really important to remember that assisted suicide is not a panacea for all ills. In 7% of cases, things go wrong. So maybe the patient might be sick, or the patient doesn't manage to swallow enough tablets. Sometimes the patient doesn't die. And what does the doctor or the nurse do at that point? Do we send them to hospital? What does the ambulance person do when they're called? And the Scottish Ambulance Service put in a really robust response to the Scottish Government, saying, what do we do in those kind of crises? And the next question is it safe? So I know the Glasgow Disability Alliance weren't able to come tonight, and I know that they send their apologies. But I know they also spoke to Humza Yousaf about 18 months ago, and they told him that no safeguards could give sufficient protection for disabled people who might feel pressured to take their own life. So I know that they even have members amongst them who might be in favour in principle, but having lived through COVID and the number of difficulties of experiencing lack of care and lack of access to care, that they feel that this cannot be the right way for us as a community to respond. And we would point to examples such as Canada. So in 2015, Canada introduced assisted suicide for those who were terminally ill, but it was almost immediately challenged by those who were chronically ill and felt that they did not have access to this as a healthcare service. So it was extended from those who were terminally ill to those who were chronically ill, and then even to those who were chronically mentally ill. And that was actually passed as well into law. But because there was an outcry, because of people like you, because of psychiatrists who were concerned, it was paused in Canada. And so it has not been implemented, and they have paused it until 2027 for time to think about how on earth they can implement helping some people commit suicide at one end of the hospital and helping prevent suicide at the other end of the hospital. We could also point to places like the Netherlands or Belgium, where we know that it applies to children. Netherlands even has a protocol for those who are under 1. For disabled babies, there is a Groningen protocol for assisting the deaths of those who have severe disability. Do they have capacity? Do they consent? You just see how what is posited as strict and safeguarded legislation just opens as soon as it is passed. It is just so easy to challenge it in terms of equality of access. Coercion. Doctors are not trained in terms of assessing coercion. We do not have the skills to determine when someone's in a controlling or coercive relationship. And we do not have the training or skills to prevent that happening in an assisted suicide setting. I spoke recently to a professor of medicine in Glasgow who has many research papers to his name and looked after, now newly retired, but used to do week after week acute ward rounds assessing unwell patients. And he said that assessing capacity, whether somebody could make that kind of decision, was the most difficult thing that he did in his week. And he was extremely good at his job. It's easy to see it when it's clear, either clearly there or clearly not there. But there's a whole grey area where it's just incredibly difficult. And, this is the last decision that anybody would make. What we normally do is try and enhance people's autonomy, enhance people's choices, but this would be the last wish that they would exercise. And we know it's not just external pressures. It may even be relatively rare that it would be because of malign effects of family and friends. It may be much more that people say, I really feel a burden. I really feel that this money shouldn't be spent on me, but would be better spent on young people. Or, I want the money that I've saved up to go to my grandchildren for their education. And we know that about half of people in Oregon who choose this do so. They cite one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is because they feel a burden on their caregivers. And this is not just a piece of legislation for a small number of people. It is about how we as a society function. Who are we as a community? What will we do when somebody feels a burden? Will we step up and give them the care that they need, or will we offer them the means to take their own life? So the prohibition of killing is one of the fundamental principles that most people can generally agree on. It's not just, a religious precept. The sanctity of life, it's sometimes called. Actually, most people across communities would say the individual value and worth of their neighbour is incredibly valuable to them, so that not killing them is actually incredibly important. The UN Declaration describes the recognition of the inherent dignity, the equal, inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the whole world. And that was a reaction. It was a reaction to the Second World War and the atrocities that were seen. It was a reaction to the Nuremberg trials and the flagrant misuse of human rights that were seen there. And we tamper with that at our peril. Assisted suicide is not safe, but it's also not right. Instead, we need improved palliative care, the right care for the right person at the right time. It cannot be right that we have more MSPs in Scotland than we have palliative care doctors. And we need to improve social care and psychological support so that we don't provide assisted suicide within a 2-week window, but there is no chance that you would get to see a psychologist or a specialist nurse to talk about the things that are really on your mind. We need to think about what it is really to have intensive care, not with drips and lines and machines, but with care and family and love. And this is the challenge to us. How will we respond to those who are desperate, lonely and distressed? The current law, the law that prohibits killing, that is the safeguard for doctors and patients. And I would so urge you to speak to your MPs this week especially, and your MSPs over the next few weeks and months, to urge them to vote against the bills in our Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Gillian. At this point, I'll allow 3 questions or comments, as long as they're short, before we go on to the next speaker. And if somebody will take this mic so that we all can hear what you want to say. Okay, Catherine, thank you. So if anybody wishes to ask Dr. Gillian a question or has a comment.
I would just like to comment on the fact that when my mother died, before she died, she said, "Do you remember, Margaret, and all the experience that I've had?"
It's gone, no, it's gone. Push the button at the bottom. So I'll just... Yeah, did you get the gist of the question? Yeah.
It's just to say that my mother was a very, very good nurse.
Yeah.
Exceptionally good nurse. Lived her whole life nursing, looking after her family, you know, all that. And she said to me, I've never heard any patient say they want.
Thank you. I think it was Margaret said that her mother was an extremely experienced, I think it's cutting out, I'll speak to you. I think Margaret said that her mother was an really experienced nurse, and said that in the whole of her nursing career didn't have anyone ask to die. I think that there's a truth in that many very experienced clinicians don't have that, and I've heard other people say that. I remember two people particularly that did ask that, and I think we need to remember that sometimes a wish to die can be part of a depressive illness. So when people are depressed, they can express that wish, and that sometimes depression can go alongside a terminal illness, and people, maybe people even here in the room have had thoughts like that, and it's really important to share that with someone else so that we can have somebody, come alongside them. But there's things we can do, there's things that you can be supported, and I think it troubles me that, an antidepressant medicine, for example, it can be extremely helpful, but takes at least 3 or 4 weeks, maybe even 5 or 6, even to start working. So to contemplate helping someone to take their life within 2 weeks, perhaps 3 in England and Wales, but not give them the chance of a proper go at an antidepressant at the very least, or some intervention from a psychologist or a psychiatrist, is really concerning. So thank you. I absolutely. I think what we want is that people are so well cared for that nobody feels like that. But I know that there will be some people who are who struggle with their mental health alongside that. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
Gillian, I'm not trying to pick you up on
No.
this, but I'd like you to distinguish in Canada the legislation for MAID being available is for the chronically mentally ill.
Yep.
Has been suspended.
Yes.
Not in the previous legislation.
Yes, my understanding is that, so in Canada they have euthanasia, which is sometimes called MAID, medical assistance in dying, and almost 99% of that is euthanasia. So euthanasia is when the doctor or nurse can give a lethal injection, whereas assisted suicide is when the person takes the medicine themselves. And in Canada, the majority is euthanasia, a very small number is assisted suicide. And they introduced MAID or euthanasia for those with a terminal illness when the disease was felt to be, or death was felt to be reasonably foreseeable, was what they described it as in 2015. And then because of challenge, it was extended to those with a chronic physical illness. And then it was challenged again, and it was allowed for psychiatric illness on the statute books, but that's never been implemented. So what's possible at the moment is MAID or euthanasia for terminal illness and chronic illness. And you're absolutely right, the proportions are such that the vast majority is terminal illness, but there is a small minority that is for chronic illness. So somebody with chronic pain or a chronic Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis, something like that, that's not felt to be the person imminently dying. So thank you for the clarity of that. Yes. Yeah. You're going to bellow. Bellow. Yeah, that's good.
doctor, I have to say.
Thank you.
And I would hate to think that anyone thought I assisted somebody to die. I
Yep.
like to think I assisted them to live while they were dying.
Exactly. And I think that's, I think it's really important for us to have this debate about palliative care and for people to understand what palliative care is. I actually think that partly explains why sometimes in the polling people are asked, would you like assisted dying? And a good number of them think that actually what they're answering is what we would think of as good palliative care. And yeah, absolutely, I'd like to reassure everybody that modern standard palliative care does not hasten death in any sense. Absolutely, my former colleagues would give medication to help symptoms such as pain, but they titrate those, so they edge them up very carefully. And there is never a sense that you give one big dose of any medication that would hasten death, and that would be intentional killing, as in any other context. And so I think that we are often challenged on that, and that this is just another tool in the palliative care toolbox. We're nearly doing it anyway, so why are we squeamish about this? But actually there's a really clear ethical line between supporting someone to live until they die and helping them with symptom control or pain control, but not actually taking a specific act to intentionally kill them. And that's why the drugs used are actually quite different from what we would use in palliative care. So no, a really helpful question, thank you. I appreciate we're only speaking for a few minutes and it's not easy to make everything clear, so thank you, that's a very helpful question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gillian, and also to you for the comments and questions that you have been asking. So thanks very much for that. I'm going to move on with our next speaker, who is Dr. Gordon MacDonald, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Care Not Killing. Most of you probably know Dr. MacDonald, but just in case, Care Not Killing is a UK-based alliance of individuals and organisations which brings together disability and human rights groups, healthcare providers and faith-based bodies with the aims of promoting more and better palliative care, ensuring that existing laws against euthanasia and assisted suicide are not weakened or repealed, and influence the balance of public opinion against any further weakening of the law. Gordon has had a richly varied career. He also worked for UNICEF, the UN's Children's Emergency Funds, lectured at economics at Coventry University, and so it gives me great pleasure, to introduce to you Dr. Gordon MacDonald, who's going to speak about the various bills in Westminster and in the Scottish Parliament. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, John, and it's a pleasure to be here on this cold night. Unfortunately, Gillian and I didn't make it to the march, so we admire your courage, but I was on childcare responsibilities this afternoon, and I had to leave them in the charge of my 18-year-old daughter as I rushed out the door whilst waiting for my wife to get home from work. So thanks for your invitation. I just want to update you really on what's happening with the two bills, the one at Westminster and the one at Holyrood. We'll start with Holyrood because obviously that's been closest to us, but I think at the moment the more urgent one is the one at Westminster, as I'll come on to in a minute. Now, the bill in the Scottish Parliament has been in the pipeline for quite a while. They first started planning this bill back in 2015. There were, of course, two previous bills at the Scottish Parliament which were brought forward by Margot MacDonald. And the very first time euthanasia was raised in the debate in the Scottish Parliament was back in 2000, when the Adults with Incapacity Bill was being considered. So there's been an ongoing consideration of this issue over and over again, and every time what we've seen happen is the more MSPs think about the issue, the more likely they are to vote against. And that's what's happened the last two times that there have been bills brought forward in the Scottish Parliament. So this bill was, as I said, after the last bill was defeated in 2015, there was a group of MSPs, about 6 of them, who cross-party, who decided to form a cross-party group where they get together, they hear from evidence from and have speakers from different places. And they spent 5 years thinking about and planning what the next bill would look like, and hearing speakers coming from overseas, from Canada, from Australia, etc. They didn't actually bring a bill in that Parliament, but then there was the Scottish election, and then after the Scottish election, Liam MacArthur obviously announced that he was going to bring forward a bill. He brought forward a proposal, which he got about 30 MSPs signing. And then he had launched a consultation. That took a few months. It then took about another 6 months for them to process all the responses they got to the consultation, and eventually they got round to bringing forward a bill. So that process has lasted about 2 years since the last Holyrood election before they got round to actually introducing the bill. And we're at the stage now where the Scottish Parliament assigned the bill to the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee to scrutinise it. They issued a call for evidence. They got about 20,000, I think it was, responses to that call for evidence over the summer. I don't believe that they've read them all. There were about 1,000 of them that were substantive, as in they were thought through and considered pieces of work that had been submitted. So those 1,000 have to be read. But nevertheless, they're being read by one of the researchers in the Scottish Parliament Information Service. And there will no doubt be a report produced. But the committee is taking oral evidence, and they've taken 3 weeks of oral evidence now. There's going to be a pause over Christmas, and then they will take more oral evidence in January. And Jill and I are both going to be giving oral evidence on the 21st of January. And then what will happen is there will be another pause whilst they consider what's put in their report. They'll produce a report, and we're probably looking at a stage 1 debate in about March, just before Easter, when the whole Parliament will debate the bill and decide whether to vote for it or not. Now, normally we would be of a view that if a bill gets passed at stage 1, then it's likely to end up on the statute book. It might get amended a bit at stage 2, but I don't think that's the case on this occasion, because for a number of reasons. First of all, quite a few of the MSPs are undecided, still undecided, and they say, well, I support it in principle, but I want to see the safeguards, and I'm not sure that there will be sufficient safeguards, and I'm concerned about the implication on my constituents, my vulnerable constituents, and I'm concerned about the health service and how it can cope and other such things. And so it's quite possible that the bill might get passed at stage 1 and still not get on the statute book, because MSPs will then look at the detail of the bill and say, well, actually, I'm not comfortable that this bill is a well-drafted and good bill and is a safe bill. So the fight doesn't stop at stage 1, regardless of what happens. It carries on. And then the other thing I would say about that is that Liam MacArthur has been, the process that they went through in trying to develop this bill was they said, well, we're going to produce the best bill in the world. We want to cover all the bases. We want to make sure that nobody can criticise this bill the way they did the previous 2 bills, because the previous 2 bills were found at committee to be fairly flawed and poorly drafted. And so they planned to have this excellent bill. This was the rhetoric that was being said. Anyway, they then produced a bill which, of course, is not perfect. It's far from perfect. It's full of flaws. However, in the process, they put into the bill 2 powers which are, in fact, reserved to Westminster and not devolved to the Scottish Parliament at all, over medical regulation and drug licensing. So that's essentially the conscience clause for healthcare staff, and the approval by Scottish ministers of the substances that will be used. And because those powers are reserved to Westminster, the Scottish Parliament has no power to legislate for that. So that's why it's now run into a big problem. They need permission from Westminster to legislate for that. Now, the bill could still end up in the statute book, but what that would mean would be that there would be no mechanism for the Scottish Government ministers to regulate how people were killed, what substances would be used, what drugs would be used. So potentially you could have Dr. Nitschke with his personal gas chamber, which you've probably seen in the press, turning up in Scotland and setting it up without being able to be prosecuted, because there wouldn't be any way for the Scottish ministers to say what mechanism should be used for assisting suicide. And then the second thing would be that there would be no effective conscience clause. So despite Liam promising throughout the whole process that doctors wouldn't, and nurses and other pharmacists and others wouldn't be forced to participate, they would in fact have no effective conscience opt-out at all if the bill was to end up in the statute book. So I think politically that's going to be difficult for him, and obviously the key question then is Westminster going to either agree to devolve those powers on a temporary basis to the Scottish Parliament, or to legislate to amend the bill subsequently to put those powers into it. Now my gut feeling is to the answer is no, because the only time that those powers have been used before Section 30 were to allow the independence referendum in 2014. So from a political point of view for the Labour government, that's very problematic, because they would be setting a precedent that on any issue, whether it's immigration, employment law or the Constitution, that the Scottish Parliament can propose a bill, and Westminster will then consider devolving those powers on a temporary basis to allow that legislation to pass. So I think that's very problematic for the UK government. But leaving that aside, the key issue, I suspect, is going to be what happens at Westminster. And this brings me on to the bill at Westminster. And we've got a very different situation at Westminster. At Westminster, what has happened is we have somebody who came high up on the private member's ballot. Of course, you're probably aware the Prime Minister is personally supportive of a change in the law. He voted for it back in 2015, the last time the House of Commons debated a bill. He made a commitment to Esther Ranson that he would allow time for a vote in the House of Commons on a bill to legalise assisted suicide. And then when the private member's ballot happened, and the way that works is that essentially if you're in the top 7, in the top 7 of the 20 or so MPs who come out in the private member's ballot, then you've got a good chance of having your bill debated and voted on, and possibly progressing into law at Westminster. And so, but in the House of Commons, they don't say what the bill is that they're bringing forward. They just put their name in a hat, and then once they find out where they are in the draw, they then decide what bill to bring. So there was then quite a lot of lobbying going on and pressure going on. And the suggestion in the media was that some of this pressure was coming from within government, from other sources within government, senior sources within government, perhaps even the Prime Minister himself. And that was being applied to those MPs who came up in the ballot to bring forward an assisted suicide bill. And so for a few weeks there was some lack of clarity as to what was going to happen, but then Kim Leadbeater, who was number one, announced that she was going to bring forward this bill. And we only saw the bill about a week ago. So it was only 2 weeks before the vote that the bill was actually published, and people could begin to look at the bill and see whether there were problems with it. But interestingly enough, what has been happening is that more and more organisations have been commenting publicly and saying, even though they're neutral, saying there are problems with this bill. So today, Liberty, the Human Rights Campaign and Advocacy Group, has come out and said in the press that they're not opposed in principle to assisted suicide, but they can't support this bill because it's flawed and it's going to put vulnerable people at risk. And then the Equality and Human Rights Commission has also come out and said, although they're neutral in principle on the issue, they nevertheless have concerns about some of the human rights implications of this bill as well. And this sort of touches on what Gillian has said, the so-called slippery slope, or logical cliff, as some people call it. Basically, that if you pass a piece of legislation, once you've changed the law, the question before the courts is not should the law change, but is this law fair? Does this law meet existing legal requirements in relation to human rights and equality? And of course, equal access is one of the one of the European Convention of Human Rights under Article 14. So people who are campaigning for this bill will say, oh, the bill will not be extended by the courts. But they can't say that. The fact that the courts in the past in the UK have always said it's for Parliament to change the law does not mean that if this law goes through, that the courts will continue to do that in the future. Because the question before the court is a different question. The question before the court, as was the case in Canada, is you've passed this law, now is it fair? And if you have somebody who has a chronic illness or somebody who has, say, 6 months and a prognosis of 6 months and 1 day, as opposed to 6 months from their doctor, and of course you've got to remember that doctors actually regularly get prognosis wrong and it's not an accurate science, so there isn't, in substance, anything to determine or differ somebody who a doctor says has 6 months to live from somebody who a doctor says has 6.5 months to live or 7 months to live, for example. So that's where the courts may well say, well, this is an arbitrary restriction, so you need to, and therefore it's discriminatory and it should be removed. And then there would be a duty on Parliament to legislate to remove that. So that's the courts, but there's also the political imperative, and there's already over 50 MPs at Westminster who've said the law should go further. And there's a campaign group called My Death, My Decision, which is the humanists, mainly the humanists in England and Wales, who are campaigning for a broader law, a law much more like the Canadian law, which allows both euthanasia, where the doctor actively kills the patient, as well as assisted suicide, and where it would apply to people who are chronically ill, not just people who are terminally ill. And there will even be people who would campaign for it to apply to people who are mentally ill, who are deemed to be suffering. And that's what we've seen happen in every jurisdiction, that the law has expanded to some degree. In some places like Belgium and the Netherlands and Canada, it's expanded to very rapidly and to include people who are mentally ill, people who are depressed, people with dementia, even including children in Belgium and in the Netherlands now, even including disabled infants aged up to 12 in the Netherlands. These things don't hit the headlines, but this is what is the reality. The law has been expanded, the scope of the law has been expanded, and the practice has been expanded. So, for example, in the Netherlands, when they introduced the Groningen Young Protocol, which applies to severely disabled infants aged under 12 months, that was only done without a change in the actual legislation, but with a protocol that was drafted and written up by a university department and was then began to be implemented by the doctors, and the courts accepted it and didn't find it to be illegal, even though the law had not been actually changed. But if you go to somewhere like Oregon or some of the US states, what has happened there is there have been attempts to change the law which haven't succeeded, but what has happened, the letter of the law, but what has happened is they've reinterpreted the law that was there to broaden the categories. So in Oregon, for example, we have people who are refusing treatment who are now deemed to be terminally ill. So there have been cases of anorexia, not just in Oregon, but in some other US states, Colorado and Washington as well, and also in other places. And it's been documented 60 cases of young women with anorexia, so-called terminal anorexia, who have been given assistance to commit suicide because they are deemed to be so far progressed that there is no hope of recovery. And the other thing, of course, is that people may refuse treatment or refuse food and fluids, and then they're deemed to be terminally ill because they will inevitably die, and that's been happening in Canada. So these are all the shocking things that are beginning to happen, and you can see how the pressure is for the law to expand. And then the other thing that happens is that the numbers go up all the time. And again, you will be told by those who want to see the law change at Westminster or at Holyrood that we should just look at Australia, or we should look at Oregon, where the numbers are small. But if you look at Australia, what you see is, you see that between the different states in Australia, the numbers are very different. So for example, in the state of Queensland, in the first year that the law was in force, which was for reporting year, which was July 2023 to June 2024, there were about 793 what they referred to as voluntary assisted deaths, in other words, mainly assisted suicides and some euthanasia deaths. Now, if you multiply that up and compare it to the population of the UK, the population of Queensland to the population of the UK, what you find is that that would be essentially 10,000 deaths in the first year in the UK. And what we are always assured when these bills are being proposed, and are being assured now at Westminster, is, well, it's only a very few people, and it won't be like Belgium, it won't be like the Netherlands, it won't be like Canada, or we should look at Australia instead. But actually, when you look at Queensland and Australia, what you see is that we will be talking about thousands of people. So coming back to the Westminster Bill. So one of the proposed safeguards that's been included in the Westminster Bill, which is completely impractical in my view and will be very quickly removed, is that not only do 2 doctors have to say that the person is terminally ill, but then the application has to go before a judge. Now, there are 19 family court judges in England, and it's estimated that they have about 19,000 hours available for sitting in court. And Sir James Mundy, the former head of the family division, has estimated that if each case took 2 hours of a judge's time, then that would be 37,000 hours. So how are you going to fit 37,000 hours into 19,000 hours? And what about all the other cases that the family courts are meant to be considering, divorce cases, custody cases, etc. as well? So that you can see that it's not practical. So either that safeguard will be removed, or it will just become a rubber stamping exercise, or there'll have to be a huge increase in the budget for the courts and employing judges, which is unlikely to happen in that area. So there's lots and lots of implications of this legislation which haven't been thought through. And the one thing I would say to you is about that last point is the Article 2, the right to life, which has been mentioned by Gillian. In order for a system to be compliant with that, there has to be proper scrutiny. And if the scrutiny process is purely a rubber stamping exercise which takes 5 minutes by a judge, then that's not proper scrutiny. That is, in fact, no scrutiny at all. And so that's why I'm saying this bill at Westminster and the bill at Holyrood are both fatally flawed and are likely to run into trouble, either down the line with being abused or being changed or being expanded, or alternatively with legal challenges against them from either side, either because people want to expand the bill to include other categories of people, including potentially children, or because they want to challenge the legitimacy of the bill. So thank you for your time. I hope that helps explain where we've got to, and I'm happy to take questions if there's time.
Thanks, Gordon. If I could take 3 questions or comments from the floor. Okay? And again, this microphone might play dodgy, so could you speak up?
If Westminster votes no and Scotland votes yes, what happens?
So the question is, what if Westminster votes no and Scotland votes yes, what happens? I mean, it's good news at Westminster is the first thing I would say, and it may well happen that way, because I think people in the UK government are beginning to get cold feet and are realising that this perhaps wasn't the narrative that they wanted for the first few months of the new Labour government, and they've got huge ambitions for the NHS to fix the system, and that the publicity that this is attracting, as well as the fact the divisions it's causing within the Parliamentary Labour Party and within the government and the cabinet are being very damaging, actually. So I would not be surprised if it gets kicked down the tracks at Westminster. And there has been this proposal for a Royal Commission at Westminster, which Rachel Maskell proposed and Gordon Brown has now come out and supported today. And that's needed because palliative care is in a crisis. I mean, there are hospices laying people off in England and Wales, and there is a growing demand with an ageing population for more palliative care, and that's just going to increase over the next 10, 15 years or so. And there's underfunding, and the funding that's there isn't keeping pace with inflation. So there is a huge crisis in palliative care coming down the tracks, and so there is a need for a proper look at how we fund and provide palliative care for everybody. And 1 in 4 people don't get all the palliative care they need, as Joe has mentioned. So already. So I think there's a high chance that it will be delayed at Westminster. If that then happens, or rejected, if that then happens, then the Scottish Parliament could legislate for it. They could carry on and legislate, and what we would end up with is a bill which is much broader than is being proposed at Westminster, with a definition of terminal illness that can include people with decades to live. But we would end up with a bill on the statute books which had no protection for the consciences of healthcare or other people involved in the process, and where there was a sort of free-for-all in terms of the mechanism. In fact, arguably, and I'm not going to name names, but some people in the audience will know this individual, somebody said to me recently that issue to do with the drug licensing or the approved substances is potentially fatal for this bill, because the whole bill is predicated on Scottish ministers being able to approve what doctors could use to end the life of their patients, or to help the patients end their own life. Now, if the Scottish ministers don't have the power to approve them, then how does the bill operate? So they could pass the bill, and either it couldn't be implemented within the NHS because there wouldn't be any mechanism for that to happen, or doctors would have to do what they do elsewhere, which is essentially use drugs off-label in huge doses without any proper testing, and there are serious issues about the drugs that are used in Oregon and other places. Or alternatively, as I said, you could have potentially Philip Nitschke turning up with his sarcopod and gassing people, you know, as he did for the first time in Switzerland or not him, but somebody did for the first time in Switzerland a few weeks ago. And that's now been seized, but they're saying they're going to build another one. Now, that might be the most shocking example, but the point I'm saying is that if you don't have a regulated system, then how do you regulate it? My gut would be, though, that the politics of what would happen is that if Westminster said no, that Holyrood would find some way to say no, or pass the buck to Westminster and say, well, we really need to allow Westminster to legislate for Scotland. And certainly I know some of the MSPs are saying to me essentially that even if Liam MacArthur's bill gets to stage 1 and gets voted on at stage 1, they will then look to Westminster to legislate instead. But that is dependent upon Westminster deciding to go ahead and legislate, which of course we'll find out in a week and a half's time. So the most important thing to do over the next week is phone up your MP. If you can't find their number, phone the House of Commons and ask to be put through to them, or email your MP, or knock on the door of their surgery. Go and see them at their surgery if you can find out when it is, and go and say to them, look, I really hope you're going to vote against this, and have you considered all the unintended consequences for people who are vulnerable and elderly and disabled, and the issues of coercion and pressure and all the rest of it. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the point is that we don't hear much in the media about not every death is bad or chronic or difficult. Now, you've got to remember you have a very well-funded campaign with a turnover of over £2 million, nearly £3 million in 2023, that is running the push for this law to change. And they're very slick. And they keep coming out with statements which are untrue, that people with a terminal illness have a choice, they say, and even Kim Leadbeater repeated this. They say they've got a choice. They can either die in agony, they can go to Switzerland to Dignitas, or they can try and commit suicide themselves here. Now that is false. That's political spin, and it's to connect people's emotions. Actually, the vast majority of people die peacefully, or would die peacefully if they got the proper palliative care that they needed. And so it's very disingenuous of Kim Leadbeater or Dignity in Dying or others to come out with this sort of scaremongering and rhetoric, but they do it all the time, and the media pick it up and report it, which is really a shame, actually. There's somebody at the back had a question, so. Okay, can we do four? Can we do four questions?
What has been the reaction of the MPs in Westminster? What could be the impact of the letter of Gian Abbott published, I think yesterday in the Guardian, calling the MPs in Westminster and the Labour MPs not to vote for this bill?
Well, I think it'd be fair to say that Parliament is split. You've got a group that are in favour, and you've got a group that are opposed. That's largely even. And then you've got a group in the middle who are undecided. And as somebody said to me the other day, it's the undecideds that have it at the moment. So it will all depend on how many of them decide to go back to their constituencies, how many of them stay at Westminster, decide to vote for it or against it. And that may come down to the debate itself. So we really don't know what's going to happen next Friday. But all I know is that we do as much as we can to influence as many of them as possible. But there's a very active campaign going on at Westminster, lots of meetings. I went to 3 meetings in one day last week this week, in Westminster, where they were basically put on for MPs to come and hear from different perspectives. The meeting that I was speaking at, we actually had Kim Leadbeater came into it, and Lord Faulkner, who had proposed a similar bill in the House of Lords. So they came in and we had a fairly robust exchange. But anyway, well, at least myself and Lord Faulkner did. Anyway, so I think, I think there's an awful lot of people at Westminster who have yet to make up their mind. They're really actually quite troubled by it. And I think that we will see, probably we won't know what the final numbers are going to be until we see the vote. And quite frankly, it's going to go right to the wire, so we'll wait and see.
I just wanted to ask, I did write to my MP back in July, and I actually got a response from him on the 12th of November about assisted suicide. And he was sort of redirecting all sorts of places and essentially saying that this understanding with the Scottish MPs that they didn't vote on English and Welsh. We did vote on English and Welsh issues. However, he was keen to hear from me. So that's why I wrote back to him and said, again, just stating my consent. But I just wanted to get a sense from the meetings that you've been having whether or not the Scottish MPs will actually participate in the vote.
The vast majority of them will. It was the SNP that tended to take the position that on legislation applying to England and Wales they wouldn't vote if it didn't apply to Scotland, which you can understand logically from their perspective as nationalist MPs with the Scottish Parliament. However, back in 2015, when a bill was debated, they had a free vote, and about 15 of them voted for the bill and about 14 of them voted against the bill. And then the rest of them, there was about 59 of them at the time, the rest of them all adopted that position that you said they chose not to. Now, my understanding is there's 9 SNP MPs now left at Westminster, and my understanding is that they are saying that they're going to be in Scotland and not at Westminster, and that they're not going to vote, precisely, presumably because of that point. Again, the letter I saw, shall we say, I'll not say from whom, was a very long letter explaining how this was such a difficult issue, and he was very keen to hear what his constituents thought, etc., 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 and then proceeded at the end to say, but I'm going to be in my constituency and won't be voting. So that's the position I think the SNP are taking. But most of the Labour MPs, who are the vast majority of Scottish MPs, will be there and will be voting. We know some of them are going to be voting against, which is good. Some of them are undecided. Still, quite a few of them are probably still undecided. And then there's the 5 Conservative MPs from Scotland and 5 Lib Dem MPs. Now, the Conservative ones I think will mostly vote against. And the Lib Dem ones, 2 of them will certainly vote for, and 3 of them might abstain or potentially even, or might vote for, or might even potentially vote against. We'll have to wait and see. We're not quite sure where they are. So that's where we're at with that.
Thanks once again for your questions and comments, and to Gordon for his answers. We might have time at the end, where we can question the 3 speakers. We'll see how time goes. But it gives me great pleasure to bring our 3rd speaker to the stage, who is Dennis Canavan. Many of you will know Dennis from sight and from television. He was the longest serving parliamentarian in the Scottish Parliament. He was elected to the House of Commons in 1974 as Labour MP for West Stirlingshire, but following boundary changes, he was MP for Falkirk West from 1983 until 2000, when he gave up his Westminster seat to concentrate on representing his constituents in the Scottish Parliament. Interestingly enough, at the first election to the Scottish Parliament, the Labour Party leadership did not approve of Dennis Canavan's candidacy, despite the fact that over 97% of Labour Party members in his constituency voted for his endorsement as a Labour candidate. He therefore stood without the support of any political party and was elected with the biggest majority in Scotland. Cynics dismissed it as a one-off, but Dennis Canavan repeated the feat 4 years later. He was a member of the Scottish Parliament's European and External Relationship. He was convener of the cross-party sports group, vice-convener of the cross-party group on palliative care, and vice-convener of the cross-party group on international development in the Scottish Parliament. So he has got a wealth of experience in politics. But his interests include education, health, international affairs, and sport. And in his spare time, he used to enjoy, but he still enjoys watching long-distance running and hill walking, swimming, and horse riding. And he's also, unfortunately, an enthusiastic supporter of Falkirk Football Club. He can't be everything. But Dennis, comes not only with a lot of political experience, but also personal experience, because he has endured incredible personal tragedy after losing 3 sons and his only daughter since 1989. He's lost 4 children, 3 of them from terminal illness. So he's a man who knows what he's speaking about, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dennis to give us his talk.
Thank you, Chairman, for your kind words of introduction. In the unlikely event that I ever stand for re-election to any parliament, I might even ask you to be my election agent. But my apologies for being late. I travelled from my home in Bannockburn to get to this meeting. The bus was supposed to arrive at Buchanan Street at 6 o'clock, but it didn't arrive until about 7 o'clock. But anyway, it's good to be here. And my apologies too if I'm reiterating some of the points that the previous speakers have made. In fact, I seem to recognise some familiar faces in the audience here. Some of you may have attended previous meetings that I've addressed on this subject. My apologies if I'm repeating myself here and there, but as a former teacher of many years ago, I always found it was quite instructive to repeat some of the lessons. Anyway, we're here to discuss a matter of life and death. Matters of life and death are the most important matters to come before any parliament. And very soon, both the Scottish Parliament and the Westminster Parliament will be taking decisions on such a matter, namely legislation to assist terminally ill people to commit suicide. The Westminster Bill does not apply to Scotland, but it is very relevant to Scotland, because if the House of Commons votes it down next Friday at the second reading stage, then that will send a very strong message to members of the Scottish Parliament, especially those who are still undecided. Now, my views on such legislation are based partly on my own personal experience and that of my family. A couple of years ago, I joined the distinguished club of octogenarians. And since my retirement, I have survived 2 life-threatening illnesses, but thanks be to God and the National Health Service, as you can see, none of them turned out to be terminal. In fact, an old acquaintance of mine contacted me recently on social media with a message that went something like, "Dear Dennis, long time no see. I thought you were dead, but I'm glad you're no." I replied, "So am I. Yours ever, Lazarus." But my serious point is this, that even experienced doctors are not infallible when it comes to assessing how long a person has got to live. And some people who have been diagnosed with terminal illness have survived for much longer than expected and with a reasonable quality of life. I can think of many people in my age groups, some of them very vulnerable people, who experience or who will experience terminal illness and who may feel pressurized to take the suicide option proposed by this legislation because they don't want to be a burden on their loved ones. So to those who say that individuals should have a choice, and this choice argument is very compelling to some people, I say that to those who say that people should have a choice on this matter, I question whether anyone has a right to choose a course of action which could have devastating consequences for other people, especially vulnerable people. The Scottish Bill includes a so-called safeguard, whereby 2 doctors have to assess that the patient is making an informed decision without pressure or coercion. However, doctors, even experienced doctors, may not be aware of the source of potential pressure, and the patient may not be willing to admit to the existence of such pressure. Now, during the forthcoming parliamentary debates, both at Westminster and at Holyrood, I'm sure that there will be many heart-rending stories from people who have lost a loved one, perhaps a family member, in difficult, painful circumstances. I understand and sympathize with those who express such concerns. However, the proposers of the legislation claim that the bill is necessary to ensure dignity in death. I beg to differ, and I would like to share with you my family story. Some people may claim that I've been fairly fortunate in my own personal life in surviving my own health problems, but the same could not be said about my children. Last month was the 50th anniversary of my first election to the House of Commons. At that time, I was the proud father of 4 young children. Now they're all dead. And one of my biggest regrets in life is that because of my work, I did not spend more time with my children when they were young. So I probably had more than my fair share of deaths in my family. 3 of my children would have met the criteria in the proposed legislation because they died as a result of terminal illness. And they were all adults at the time of their deaths, although my then youngest son, Paul, was only 16 years of age. But according to the Scottish Bill, 16 years of age is an adult. I had the experience of watching 2 of my sons in their dying stages, and I would not wish that on any parent. However, I must say that in general, I found the standard of National Health Service treatment which my children received was excellent, and the standard of palliative care in our local Strathcarron hospice was first class. My children undoubtedly underwent some pain, but it was minimized by dedicated health professionals who did everything in their power to make their final days as comfortable as possible. As a result, my children died in dignity, and I beg to differ from those who assert that the option of assisted suicide is necessary to ensure dignity in death. Indeed, supporters of assisted suicide, they seem to have hijacked the word dignity in an attempt to justify their case. But I fail to see anything dignified about a doctor or a nurse having spent many years training to save lives, then giving patients a lethal substance to destroy lives. Whatever happened to the Hippocratic Oath which doctors were once required to swear? I have an extract here of the translation from the original Greek. It says, "I will do no harm or injustice to my patients. Neither will I administer a lethal substance to anybody when asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a course." Well, I accept that there are cases where there is justification in not prolonging life, but that is quite different from actively assisting someone to commit suicide. In the case of one of my sons, he spent his last days on a life support machine, but when it became evident that he was not going to recover, the medical professionals consulted family members who came to the unanimous decision to switch off the machine. It was a difficult, heart-rending decision, but I have no doubt that it was justified. There is a world of difference between allowing someone to die a natural death and actively assisting someone to commit suicide. Personally, I would not have the same respect for medical professionals if they were to become involved in helping people to commit suicide. The supporters of the bill prefer to use the euphemism assisted dying rather than assisted suicide. Well, over a decade ago, my good friend, the late Margot MacDonald, tried to introduce a similar bill in the Scottish Parliament. I disagreed profoundly with Margot on this issue, but at least Margot was more accurate in calling her bill assisted suicide rather than assisted dying. Suicide is a more accurate description because it would require a health professional to supply the lethal substance to the patient and for the patient to take that lethal substance under the supervision of the health professional. That is suicide by any definition. In Scotland, the suicide rate is already far too high, especially amongst young people, and Scotland's suicide rate is significantly higher than that of the rest of the United Kingdom. The Scottish Government and the UK Government quite rightly promote and support campaigns to reduce the incidence of suicide. So what kind of a confusing message are we going to be sending out to people, especially young people, by telling them that some suicides are somehow okay, or that part of our National Health Service should become a National Suicide Service? I'm also concerned that participating doctors would be obliged to make false statements on death certificates. That's under the terms of the Scottish Bill. The doctor will be required to enter as a direct cause of death the terminal illness which the patient was experiencing, rather than the lethal substance which actually caused the death. Some doctors are therefore understandably concerned about this obligation to make a false statement on a death certificate. Before I finish, I'd like to address the claim that it's only religious people that are opposed to this legislation. People of different faiths and different cultures may have different attitudes to death. Personally, I live in the hope that after I die, I shall be reunited with the children I have lost. However, I respect those who do not share that belief. And I say this to my agnostic and atheist and humanist friends. Surely we are all humanists in the sense that we believe in human rights. And if we believe that the right to life is the most basic human right, then it follows that no one has the right to choose to take human life except in defense of another human life. Similarly, no one has the right to classify some human lives as less valuable than others. And that would undoubtedly be one of the many negative consequences of the proposed legislation. Earlier this week, I visited an old friend in hospital. Jim used to be my election agent. We were a good team. In fact, we could have been called the Invincibles because we never ever lost an election. But we're not exactly invincible when it comes to matters of health. I'm still struggling on, but Jim has Alzheimer's disease. He is now very incoherent. But on some of my previous visits, I found him to be fairly lucid, especially when we spoke about our campaigns of 30 years ago or more. Now, I don't know how long Jim will last, but who am I to say that his life is less valuable than my life or the life of anyone in this hall? We are indeed on a very, very slippery slope indeed if we start classifying some lives as less valuable than others. Finally, when I express my absolute opposition to the proposed legislation, I do not simply defend the status quo. I firmly believe that more effort and more investment should go into improving standards of palliative care to make dying a more pain-free experience for terminally ill people. Our hospices are already underfunded, and investment in palliative care may be further threatened if a cheaper option of assisted suicide becomes available. What about public opinion and parliamentary precedents. While previous attempts to introduce similar legislation at Westminster and Holyrood have failed, but the consultation document on the current Scottish legislation claims that it has a majority of public support. I'm not so sure about that, and I wonder whether the detailed implications of the bill have been fully explained to the public. Of course, members of the Scottish Parliament, and indeed members of the Westminster Parliament, have a duty to listen to the views of the people they represent. But parliamentarians also have a duty to try to lead public opinion rather than always slavishly following in its wake. So I say to you, make your views known to your MPs and your MSPs. And I say to my former parliamentary colleagues, stand up and be counted. We have the chance to show a lead to many other countries on this important matter of life and death. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for that. We have got about 5 minutes for questions, because I think we've been sitting for quite a long time. So if anybody's got any questions to any of the three people.
What I wanted to know was, if doctors in Scotland will be required to not put the truth on a death certificate and say that it was suicide, how do we have any statistics? How do we keep note of how many people are dying that way?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, and that's the reason we have death certification, is so that we've got accurate statistics about the causes of death and the patterns of causes of death, so we know what things are increasing. So absolutely, and there were lots of responses to the consultation from doctors, among others, about saying this is nonsense, you have to put the actual cause of death as the cause of death. And to be fair to the Ledbetter bill, that is the case. You do put 1A, assisted suicide, secondary to terminal lung cancer or whatever. So I think they're on a sticky wicket.
I think that there is reference in the Scottish Bill to the collection of statistics. I don't know how accurate that will be, but names will not be mentioned, and I think that is the intention of the false statement on the death certificate, is that to hide the truth, as it were, and maybe it would give some comfort to the family, although in most cases I think the family would know what had happened to their loved ones anyway.
Just one other point, that there is a possibility that clause is contrary to Article 2, the right to life, because in order to protect the right to life, you have to have a effective and accurate scrutiny process of deaths. And if the deaths, if they're lying as to the cause of death, then how do you scrutinise the deaths, basically? So we'll wait and see. So, yeah.
I've got to say that I'm sitting here tonight, and as a Scot, lived all my days in Scotland, I'm actually ashamed. I'm ashamed that we've actually got to the stage where we've got to sit here and actually try and defend life. It's a disgrace that Scotland and the UK.
Can I answer a little bit of that before we ask Dr. Jill? One of the great problems in Scotland and in countries across the world is that when the National Health Service was set up, palliative care didn't exist. And so therefore when palliative care came in and the first hospices came into Scotland, they had to be funded by charity. And we have in this country world-leading, palliative care and specifically hospice care. And therefore, it is shameful that we do not spend money on palliative care. I mean, on the news this evening, is one of the hospices talking about they may have to refuse patients because of the government national health insurance on employers, and they need now another 52 million to keep going at the rate that we've got just now.
No, thank you very much. I think it's a really good important. The question is not just spending more money on palliative care, but how we design a better system. I think there's lots of aspects to it, and I suppose in a way you want government to be spending its creative thinking to work out an answer to that problem. One solution is to design better community-based services. So a lot of our funding goes into acute services, so into hospital services. And I think there is wisdom in trying to build more capacity within the community, so within general practice and hospices. But also I think there's a wisdom in really trying to provide care out of hours. So I think 9 to 5, there's often good access to services, but particularly out of hours and at the weekend, people really struggle. And there is good data to show that people might get better care during the week, but when their own GP is not there, they end up going into A&E. So I think we need to be thinking more about 24-hour services. And I know a number of regions have a 24-hour palliative care helpline, and that has been extremely useful in terms of giving access to a specialist palliative care nurse overnight, for example, because it provides reassurance but also guidance as to perhaps how patients and their families could manage overnight without having to go into A&E. I know Fife and Highland have been certainly suggesting that, but I don't think all regions have access to that. So sometimes relatively simple ideas can make quite significant differences. But you're right, there's just so much more we could do.
In that context, I think it's very important to remember that hospices in general are not 100% funded by the National Health Service. In fact, most, if not all, of the hospices in Scotland receive less than 50% of funding from the National Health Service, so they're very dependent upon voluntary contributions. And very recently, just last week in the media, including a big article in the Glasgow Herald, there was reference to the massive cutbacks in funding for hospices to such an extent that even the existence of some of the hospices may be under threat. And I attended a meeting fairly recently in the Scottish Parliament where, on the subject of palliative care, it was pointed out to me by one member of the Scottish Parliament that in Scotland today there are actually more members of the Scottish Parliament, 129 now is, than there are doctors specialising in palliative care. I ask you, who does the more valuable job? So I hope that when you write to your MPs and MSPs, as I said previously, we're not just defending the status quo, that there are people who are suffering in terminal illness, and what's going to help them most is more investment and more emphasis being put on good quality palliative care. I would now like to invite Brian and Cairns
to the stage, who's going to say a few final words, and then we will wrap up. Okay,
I'm involved with the campaign against assisted dying. Most people here will know that because I've met many people here at different meetings that have taken place. The purpose of these few words, and it's only a few words, is to make connection between the call that the different experts, because they are experts in different ways, directed towards ourselves regarding next steps. And it's just to ask you to notice a couple of things that maybe are not striking, but they are. All of the experts all say the way that we can make a difference is by doing what seems simple, and that is to contact people so as to influence them, in other words, the politicians. You're showing leadership in this by being here tonight. So it's to put a mirror in front of you, to mirror what the politicians, what the experts are saying regarding next steps and what can make a difference. And by being here tonight, that's a statement in itself. But also, this is not a platitude. I'll give you some factual information. When we were getting involved with this more than 2 years ago, through this assistance and support of Care Not Killing, our duty of care, the Catholic Parliamentary Office, and organisations within the church. Our position is a humanitarian position, it's not a religious position, but when we get involved and through the support of all of these organisations, when we began, we were faced with the information coming from Liam MacArthur that said 78% of the Scottish population were in favour of this, and he based that on a survey or consultation that had been done with the population. In the course of the 2 years, one of the things that has happened through the shared work of all of these organisations is that there's now much more evidence in the population of what happens when you legislate, and that's the thing that shows people that there are no safeguards. Final bit to do with that, why I would be confident in encouraging you in what makes a difference. The last time the Scottish Government took any form of consultation in a proper sense on this, was referred to earlier on, was in September, when they asked for call for evidence, it was called, which just is a consultation. So part of that was a tick box response, and part of it was a written response. Now, according to Scottish Government figures, not mine, 96 or 97% of organisations and individuals who wrote in with extended written information rejected the current proposals of the Scottish Government. Now, that's come about because of you and other people connected who do the basic foot soldier job, if you like, of taking the time to make contact with other people and raising concern. So, two things from my own point of view, just to finish, would be to reflect back to you what you are doing, have done and can do, because that's the thing that makes the difference, and we can claim that because we've seen evidence of that. Yeah. What's going to happen over the next period of time? The people on the platform have dealt with all of those things, so I'm not going to go back through all that at all. I've just got a straightforward, it's a kind of symbolic thing, but it's important. We've got a scroll of the concerns of the people regarding the evidence of what happens in all the countries that the experts have kept us up to date with tonight as the reasons for why we should be very afraid and very concerned about the legislation in Scotland and England. And this scroll of concerns, I'm now going to hand to Dennis, because he's the man as far as we're all concerned, I think. Yeah. And we would entrust him in doing his best through his influence as a senior politician and as a person who has connections to convey that to other politicians. Every Scottish MP already has a copy of this scroll, and every MSP will receive a copy of the scroll. So, big round of applause for Dennis, please.
Photo. Okay, our walk and our talk is now over. But I would also finally ask you to give a big round of applause to our three speakers, who are Dr. Gillian, Gordon and Dennis. And I hope that you leave the hall ready to take action, to write to your MP and your MSP. Even if you've done so already, write to them again. Ask them the question, what are they going to do? How are they going to vote? How are they going to justify their position? Even if you've written to them once, my MSPs must be fed up, because I've been at them for the last 2.5 years and I write to them every second week. I think most of my emails are now going in the bin, so I've gone writing them by hand now and posting them. So I asked them to vote. So I'd like, finally to thank you, all of you, for turning out this evening, for coming on that march and, being very supportive. But I'd also like to thank, there's a lot of people in this room, who were responsible for getting things put together, getting the whole event organised, and all done within 2 weeks. Not bad going, So I'd really like you to give you a great round of applause. I don't want to name all of them because there are so many of them involved, but thank them very, very, very much. And with that, there is only one thing left to say: goodbye.